Hi, my name is Tatiana Merced, and you are listening to the 4th episode of Musically Driven. Here we'll be talking about our favorite iconic people of color who have changed the music game over time. Enjoy! Hi, everyone. Welcome to the 4th episode of Musically Driven. Today with me, I have Dr. Raymond Wise, who is an African American and African Diaspora Studies professor at Indiana University, and he also is the director of the African American Choral Ensemble at the Indiana State University. He has worked as a music director for many different professional gospel choirs and has prepared choirs to sing for many professional artists. I brought him on the podcast today to talk to us about gospel music, the origins of gospel, why he loves the gospel genre, and his favorite gospel artists or pieces. So, Dr. Wise, I'm going to ask you who you are, what made you interested in gospel music, and what brought you to your career now?
Well, good afternoon. It's certainly glad to be with you. Thank you for having me today. My name is Raymond Wise. I'm Dr. Raymond Wise. I'm professor at Indiana University in Bloomington, Indiana. And if you ask the question of what made me interested in gospel and what brought me to this career, there is a story. I'm actually a fourth generation musician. My great grandmother was a musician, and her husband was a pastor, and her brother was actually a classically trained musician. He went to Juilliard and he played and taught at Peabody Institute and played organ and played with John Philip Sousa. So that was that generation. And then my great grandmother and her husband had 6 daughters. Four of which were musicians. And then the next generation was my mother. She was a musician. And so my mother, my father had 6 children. They were 3 older and 3 younger. And so my older brothers and sisters were singing as a trio, a gospel trio, before we were ever born. So as soon as we were born and could talk, we were put right into the family singing group. So I grew up singing gospel music as a child. But one of my great aunts, Pauline Wells Lewis, was a pioneering radio announcer in the 40s and 50s in the Baltimore, Washington, Annapolis area. And during that time, you know, if you know anything about gospel music history, it was a new musical form that wasn't really accepted in the churches. So a lot of the artists, to get this music accepted, they went out and developed what they called the gospel highway, a network of places where they could perform and sing and eat and stay. Well, my aunt was a part of that network. And not only was she on the radio, but she promoted these major concerts of all the gospel artists who were great gospel artists at that time. And because my family had a singing group, we got to sing on all those programs. So literally, we grew up singing with all the gospel greats from the golden age of gospel. So that was very important. But the interesting piece is I started singing when I was 3, playing piano around 4, composing at 9, played my first church at 12, first gospel record at 15, first album at 17. And with all of that, I decided I was not going into music because everybody said you'll be broke. And it's not as much today, but most people consider that if you did any kind of artistic career, that wasn't a real career. You need to do something else. And I believed it. So I decided I was going to be an anesthesiologist. Went to the health magnet in high school, and it only took me a couple of visits to the hospital to realize I don't even like the smell of the hospital. So that was over. So I decided to go back down to the performing arts department and major in music, started studying classical music, and decided I was going to school for music. And when I got to school, I recognized very soon that classical music and gospel music did not mix for a myriad of reasons. Some issues related to vocal health. People thought that you were damaging your voice. Other issues because the music had not been a part of the curriculum. People didn't know how to teach it. And just many, many reasons why it was not included in the curriculum. But as a result of having to fight to be both a gospel musician and a classical musician, it burned into me a vision that people need to learn how to perform African American gospel music in academic settings and not be made to feel it's inferior to other musical styles. So that set me on this 40-year path and this journey to develop pedagogy and methodology to teach people how to do gospel music and do it in a way so that it could be incorporated into academic curriculum. So it's been a long journey, but I go all the way back 4 generations or more of people who've been church musicians or gospel musicians or pioneers in the field. And that mantle, I guess, was passed down to me. And now I have a couple generations beyond me of people who are also doing music and serving. So that's how I got to gospel music.
Oh my gosh, that's so cool. That's such a cool background. Okay, so my next question would be how would you tell the origins of gospel music and spiritual music, and what is the difference between spirituals and gospels? Because I do remember you speaking about this when you came to Crane, and I
Mhm.
thought the way you defined the two and separated them was really cool. So I just wanted to hear you talk about it more.
Yeah, well, gospel music and spirituals are often confused. People tend to use the term synonymously, but they're not really the same. They are two of 7 distinct African American sacred genres. We've got psalmody, line singing, shape note singing, spirituals, hymnody, gospel music, and the standard classical art forms in which gospel musicians compose. However, because they share a lot of the common musical elements, people confuse them and they use the term synonymously, but actually they are different. And the spiritual is a predecessor, I often call it a grandparent, if you will, of gospel music. The spiritual, of course, was a music that evolved during the time when African Americans were enslaved in this country. And as a result of that music became a primary musical genre, if you will, that affected all the music of America because it evolved in different directions. It went a secular direction, a theatrical direction, an artistic direction, an academic direction, and a sacred direction. And out of the line of the sacred direction, the spiritual, which is the field spiritual they sang in the field, it then moves into what we call the congregational spiritual, where in the Pentecostal revival and movements of the early 1900s, they turned to the spiritual, began to add guitars and percussion and pianos and all of those things, and they transformed the spiritual into something that was accompanied. And then in these kind of churches, those are basically what you call storefront Pentecostal churches, they began combining blues and jazz with the white and black hymns of the church and congregational music and the quartet music. So all those things merged together to form gospel music, which comes in the 20th century. So spirituals are a 19th century musical form. Gospel music is a 20th century musical form, but gospel developed in the late 1920s and 30s when African American blues and jazz musicians came back to the church, and they brought with them the blues and jazz rhythms, and they started combining them with the hymns and spirituals of the church to form this new music called gospel music. So as they did this music, they got into the church. How did blues and jazz get there? Because many of the people who formed these storefront Pentecostal churches were former rural slaves who enjoyed the kind of emotional, effective music in the South that was not necessarily the kind of music that was being done in the North. So they wanted a musical style that was reflective of the music of their culture and of their past, of their heritage. And this music was born in these churches and has stemmed and evolved even since that time in the late 1920s and 30s.
Okay, that's okay. I love that. Okay. So then I guess that goes into my next question, because the next question would be like, how has gospel music evolved and how have you seen it evolve in your career? So I guess it adds on because you talk about how gospel music evolved from spiritual. So how have you seen it evolve from those 1920s jazz being incorporated to now?
Yes, well, absolutely. Well, gospel music today is not the same as the gospel music that was started in the 1920s and 30s. And in 2000 or so, there was actually 1997, there was a song released by a young man by the name of Kirk Franklin called Stomp. And that song was pretty controversial because they were not singing in choir robes. They had hip hop clothing and they were kind of dancing and moving and all kinds of things that were not normal for gospel music. And it made the church people really upset. And they were like, this is not gospel music. This is awful. But of course, according to Franklin, this was gospel. So it started me asking the question, what is gospel music? And so for my doctoral dissertation, I invited that question, or I entertained that question. And as I began to look at current definitions, they didn't define the older music. You look at the older definitions, they didn't find the current definitions. So I had to go all the way back to the beginning of the origins and did a history and a study from 1900s all the way to 2000. And in that time, I discovered an historical pattern that happens in gospel music. And it is this: someone comes to the church with a style that's considered too secular. Church doesn't like it, they reject it, but the secular world embraces it. And they make a lot of money. So someone in the church then takes that new style, tweaks it with some traditional elements. The church finally accepts it. They take it then to a peak, and then somebody comes in and does that again. So that pattern has already happened 5 times, and we're in the 6th transition right now. So we've got several eras that we identify based upon our research. We have the congregational era, the traditional era, the contemporary era, the word ministry era, the urban era, and then the crossover era is the era in which we are living right now. So the music is totally different from the early days to today, but each era has its own musical vocabulary and specific things that were happening in society and culture spurred artists to write and create in certain ways, to write certain themes, or to write in certain ways, or to incorporate different types of popular music into the church. And so gospel today is not at all what it was when Thomas Dorsey, who's considered the father of gospel music, began doing this music in the late 1920s and 30s.
So what would you say is your favorite era of gospel music then, out of all of those eras that you mentioned?
I would say perhaps my favorite era is the contemporary era. That's between 1960s um, to 1969, 70, even up to the present. And with all the eras, I don't give a starting and ending date because gospel music is not 100 years old. There are people who are still composing and writing in all of these styles today who are still alive. So the eras have continued and will continue as long as people are writing in those particular styles. But I like the contemporary era. That was the era, I guess, in which I came of age as a gospel artist and pianist and movement. That was the era with Clinton Utterbach Choir, with um, oh gosh, Richard Smallwood and Robert Freison and Henry Davis and all these musicians who were classically trained gospel musicians. Then at the end of the 60s, you get Edwin Hawkins coming out with Oh Happy Day. And that new music vocabulary was the vocabulary that spoke to me. And so I've always loved that. And of course, as I've gone through the years, I've certainly moved through different eras and adapted different vocabularies, but that was probably my favorite. And it still speaks to me today because many of those musicians were my mentors. And I followed them. I learned music from them. I studied them or studied with them. And they were the formative years of me developing as a musician.
Wow, that is so cool. So I'm gonna segue into like more of like your career and what you do. So when reading about gospel music, oh wait, never mind. I'm gonna segue more into like the music part. So when reading about gospel music, because we mentioned this how jazz was like incorporated into gospel music, it was mentioned how important improvisation was in the genre, especially with the piano. So how do you utilize improvisation when music directing gospel music?
Well, the one thing about gospel music is based upon the African aesthetic of a collective art, meaning that there's a sense of call and response. It's not just in the European aesthetic, which is performer observed, where performer does it and everybody sits and looks respectfully and listens. The African tradition is call and response. It's a collective art. Everybody participates. So consequently, just the nature that the audience and the performer are in the same room, they will encourage each other to do something different. For example, say if I'm singing a song, or many times you hear singers sing a song and they sing the verse, then they say, "Can I say it one more time?" Right? Well, if the audience says, "Yeah, say it one more time," well, they'll say it one more time. Well, then they may say it again. "Can I say it one more time?" And that's the 50th time, then one more time. But at any rate, the fact, because of that circular nature of the audience performer in this collective art, your art can change every time because of the response of the audience or the performer. But also, there was a sense that there was a freedom in this music, that you create the music in that moment. You are not stuck to have to do a performance that has to be this way every time. It will change as you change. You know, you may be cold and you sing a different way. You may be hot, you sing a different way. You may be angry, you sing a different way. You may be joyful, you sing a different way. And as a result of that, you will change the way that you perform it. You may do the verse twice. You may do the verse 10 times. You may do the chorus. You may go back to the verse. You may change it up. You may add something. You may do it slow. You may do it fast. So all those factors will allow you to change it as you are feeling in that moment. But there is a freedom in the African tradition to improvise, to create based upon what is happening in the moment. And that's what's so exciting about gospel music. It is not just static, but it's in flux. It's always moving and it always changes. And people need to understand as they perform it, they have that permission to do something different.
So when I was reading on your background, I saw a lot of experience in preparing different choirs for different productions or artists. So like how would you go about that process and how are like songs selected, how are vocalists selected? Like what is your rehearsal process like?
Well, the main thing is I've directed many choirs over the years, but as a result of my work with choirs, often I would get the opportunity to put together choirs for professional musicians or national recording artists. I worked for many years with the McDonald's Gospel Fest Committee, and they would often bring in major national recording artists, and I would be the one responsible for developing the choirs and putting together people who would back them up, as well as the band and so forth, and kind of serving as the music director. So I did that for many years. And then in addition, there have been so many other opportunities because I'm also a classical musician as well, where I was also able to then put together choirs to accompany classical concert artists as well, or to do opera performances or theater performances. So it's really, really cool. And what my blessing has been is throughout my life, I've had access to singers. In 1979 or in the 70s, as a teenager, I had a group called Raymond Wise and the Community Ensemble of Baltimore. And I literally wrote music for them every year. I'd write a new concert of music. We do original music. And even as teenagers, we were singing, we recorded music, we were doing some really, really great things. So they were always available to sing. Even when I moved from Baltimore, Maryland to Columbus, Ohio, I developed a choir called Ray's Productions Choir. And this choir was comprised of singers who could sing pretty much whatever I wrote or different styles of music. So we sang choral music and spirituals and gospel music as well. So as a result of that kind of versatility, we would often get called and asked to participate and work with other national artists. So that was the way that I've always thought and always felt blessed, because having the experience in both worlds, I've been able to then fit as a bridge to help bring singers and people back and forth to work in both of those settings.
So, okay, that's so cool. And then my next question is, so when going into, I just want to make sure I didn't skip anything, sorry. So when going into teaching a choir, because I recognize this when teaching Crane chorus, and when Rose brought you in, this is a lot of us, like the people of color in Crane, it's a big question. And like it's in also my first episode of one of my podcasts, because I bring in some people of color in Crane, and we talk about like what is it like to be a person of color in the music school, like what is it like to not really learn the stuff of our backgrounds and things like that, and like what am I doing will be a good effect on the people in the school, and like the listeners and stuff like that. So TJ, he brought up like pedagogy and like how going about teaching that stuff in the classroom, especially to people who are not people of color. So my question is, so when going to teaching a choir that is not predominantly people of color, how does that determine the selections of music? And what would you say is appropriate and not appropriate to bring into a choir of non-people of color?
Well, the main thing is, many years ago, as I was in undergraduate school, and I told you the challenges I had in trying to be both a gospel and classical musician, I had to fight. One of the things that people often said was that gospel music was not a teachable art form. Unless you came from the Black community, you couldn't do gospel. And that, in my mind, was really an excuse to say, we don't want it and you're not going to have it in the academy. But that was also the impetus for me to say, no, I'm going to find ways to create pedagogy and methodology to teach it to people who don't come from this background. So literally for 40 plus years, that's what I've been developing, ways to teach people who do not come from tradition how to do that. So the issue is there are skills, if you will, involved in singing. Many people just see it as a gift or talent of those who come from a certain tradition. However, when you look back and analyze it and take it apart, there are specific core elements and performance practices and certain things that you can do that will help you to sing more authentically. So as I looked at that, I knew that was a challenge. And for many people, especially those who are formally trained, who are not used to learning anything without scores, that was a challenge, because generally gospel music is taught by rote. So the idea of how do you teach people to use their ears and to use the musicianship in different ways. So it's always been a challenge to be able to go into different environments. But the idea is, again, having been trained in both worlds, I'm able to say this is that or that is this. So I can go to those who are classically trained and use their language to teach them about gospel music. But then I can also go to gospel musicians who've never been formally trained and use their language to teach them about classical music. And then in the middle, people can meet in that middle place. So I spent literally most of my career developing pedagogy to teach people. For over 20 years, we ran a school in Columbus, Ohio called the Center for the Gospel Arts, where we literally taught classes in all the gospel arts, piano and voice and composition and all of these aspects. And so I literally developed pedagogy and methodologies and training manuals to teach people how to do these specific things. And those are the same things that I use as a basis for my teaching when I'm teaching in the academy. Now, you said something about what is appropriate and what is not appropriate. Well, several things. When you look at the sense of church versus state, or the separation of church and state, there was a sense that if you're going into public institutions, we are not there to proselytize or to get people saved. We are there because it's an academic institution. So therefore, when I'm teaching generally in public spaces, non-sacred spaces, I am not necessarily singing and performing music that's more about belief and about the faith in the way of becoming a Christian or a person of that particular faith, but there's so many other things like celebration and praise and hope and other areas that you can sing that anybody from any religious group could sing. People who don't even have a sense of spirituality, they can sing. So you try to find things that work in that area, as you're going into different areas, so that you can welcome people into the music, into the style, but they can find a place to enjoy it, even if they don't necessarily believe it. Now, the other thing that goes along with that, when you said what is appropriate, there is a big thing that's going on in years lately about appropriation, the whole notion that African American music has been picked up, adopted, and taken over in many regards for profitable financial gain by people outside of the African American community. So for some, they're like, you know what? This music should not be taken. It should only be performed by Black folks. And I understand the fear and the anxiety, but the sense that this music of hope and joy and peace is not just the music for Black people. It's everybody needs hope. Everybody needs peace. Everybody needs joy. So if you're open to do that, then it's open. Now, that does not mean that there are some stories everyone cannot sing. All right. So, for example, if you're singing, I was down in the valley and I couldn't get up. Well, if you're 3 years old, hopefully you're not down in the valley, right? But there's certain things that are relative to the Black experience that perhaps people in, outside of the community may not really be able to sing. Now, that does not mean that there are things you cannot sing if you're not African American. For example, I think of the spirituals, for example, when they use the dialects and some of the language and the way that they speak. There are many non-African Americans who are apprehensive because they're like, I don't want to feel like I'm making a mockery or whatever. But the other thing is, in terms of authenticity, we spend moments and years and hours trying to perfect Bach, and Beethoven and Brahms and everyone else. So if this music is coming to the Academy, we must also spend that time to perfect it and to learn to do it authentically. So as we do that, if there is something that is in question, I always suggest that people offer a disclaimer and say, listen, I know I'm not from this tradition, but I think this music is valuable, and we're not making a mockery, but we're doing the very best we can to be as authentic as possible. If you can help us to be better, we invite you to come help us, but we just feel this music is important and we want to share it. So I generally try to give permission to people to share the music, to participate, and to be a part of it. And once they do, they find a different experience that's very different than the traditional European classical experience. So for many people, those things are what keep them away from the music. The sense that they can't assess it. They're not used to doing anything without sheet music. I can't sing without music. Yes, you can. So the idea is gospel is a full body experience. And as you learn it by rote, you're memorizing it, which frees you now to clap and to rock and to use your hands and to use your whole body to emote and tell a story. So as I'm going in terms of selection, the other piece is knowing with whom you're working. Now, if I'm working with, formally trained singers, who could sing and can read the music, then I may go with one sense of repertoire. If I'm going with singers who've not had a lot of formal training and really are not the best gifted, if you will, in terms of their voices, I would choose a different set of music. But the idea is to match the music to the people with whom you are working, and then you can find a level of success if it aligns with who you're working.
That's so cool. Okay, so and then this question's not written down, but it popped in my head so what do you think, so if I just curious, like what do you think like more institutions would look like if they allowed more music from different backgrounds, or like from African American backgrounds? What do you think institutions would look like?
Well, I think they'd look extremely different. One of the challenges that we're facing right now in the Academy is many music programs are on the decline. And they're on decline almost because of self-inflicted wound. For so many years, they have been exclusive in terms of saying only people who have these credentials or can do these things are allowed to come in. And those who come in who don't have those things are either dismissed or they don't fare very well because they don't have the skills to be successful. But what's happening now is in the last 20, 30 years, with many of our K through 12 schools no longer having arts programs, we no longer have these programs that are growing and grooming all these students who are necessarily singing in choir and doing band and all of that, from kindergarten through 12th grade. So now we don't have that feeder system just feeding us all these kids. So the numbers in many academies are in decline. So what's happening is they're finding that if you really want to get people in the seats, you got to offer music that is appealing to the people, music that the people like, music that the people understand, and music to which they can relate, which will bring them into the seats. And even if, that's what gets them to the seats, it may be an opportunity to expose them to something that might be a bridge to move them into something else. But it's certainly important to know that, if we want our schools to continually grow, we must be mindful of the constituents that we have. Who's in our audience? Who's in our community? How do we reach the people that are really with us, as opposed to the ideal, perfect person who may never show up at our door?
All right, I love that response. Okay, so those are all my questions. I do a segment in my podcast. It's called The Music That Speaks to Me. It could be anything you want. It's just like right now, anything that speaks to you, or like anything that you've been listening to. It's just something that it makes it cool, makes it fun. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, there are many things. Of course, I'm a lover of gospel music. One of my favorite gospel artists and mentors is Richard Smallwood. When I was a young teen, I literally would follow his choir. He had a choir called Union Temple. I'm from Baltimore, Maryland. He was in D.C., and his choir would come and sing, and I'd take my little tape recorder and sit there and watch. But what I liked about Richard Smallwood, also Henry Davis, who was also a Howard graduate, and Robert Friesen went to Virginia Union, and Mark Payne, all these guys in the Baltimore, Washington area, but they were classically trained musicians. And I loved what they did. And I wanted to study classical music so I could play gospel music in the way that they did. Well, at any rate, they were certainly mentors of mine. And then, of course, the Hawkins family, Edwin Hawkins and Walter Hawkins, they were great mentors because, as I said, that music spoke to my heart. I was blessed in the 80s to have an opportunity to work with the Hawkins Corporation in California and play a little bit with them. And that was really, really cool. But their music spoke to me. So they were great mentors. Then, of course, you have Andre Crouch, and then you have, Thomas Whitfield. So it was a wonderful group of contemporary artists. I called the Contemporary Five, who really changed the whole vocabulary for gospel. And to this day, almost anything that people are doing, you can trace back to that innovative music that they were doing. Now, of course, I always like the traditional folks. We always sang with James Cleveland and the Cleveland Singers and all of those folks as well. But beyond the gospel side, I'm now teaching a class, which is the classical art music of Black composers. And so there's some beautiful wonderful music composed in the Western European style by Black composers. And we had a wonderful class the other day. We were talking about classical musicians during the antebellum period, during slavery and so forth. There was a man, they called him Thomas Blind Wiggins, Blind Tom, and he was actually autistic. He was a savant. And he could play pretty much anything he heard, but he was so gifted in music that he composed. He was a natural at hearing different kinds of sounds and began to write tone poems on the piano and different poems, representing the things that he heard. So he wrote a piece called The Battle of Manassas, which was really great. And it really visualized the whole war scene. He had the drums going, he had the fife going, he had the bombs smashing, he had the Dixie theme, he had the national Star Spangled Banner theme, they even had the French national anthem theme. All these things were mixed up, telling the story of this war. But it was an ingenious piece by this man who was blind. And it was like fantastic, in the 1800s, right? And he was one of the most, highest paid, significant grossing Black concert artists of the time. Now, he was enslaved, and of course, his masters and the artists took advantage of him. They made a whole lot of money off of him that he did not make, but he was a musical genius. And some of his works are fantastic. So we've got other artists, of course. We've got moving to the Harlem Renaissance period. We got, from Harry Burleigh to William Grant Still and Florence Price, her pieces, her anthems, her symphonies, Margaret Bond, her art songs, her piano pieces. So there's some wonderful pieces there. Now, I have been for the last 30, 40 years so in the gospel music, that's really where my mind stays. And every now and then I'll listen to some other things. And of course, I've got a son who's young, and I'll hear all this stuff that he's playing. But generally, I'm a lover of gospel music, beyond the classical ones, people like Ricky Dillard, a new generation. They're a young group, and they've got this real big sound with vibrato. And some people don't like that, but I love it. I love the Ricky Dillard vibrato, and I love the choirs. So I'm just really excited about the gospel choirs. And that age of choirs from the 60s to the 80s or so was really, those moments that were really great. So pretty much, I'm a composer as well, too. So I write a lot of music. And I'm often listening to the music I'm writing and creating because I'm working with specific groups, and I will often create works, and I'm commissioned to do specific works for specific groups. In fact, I'm excited right now. We just were commissioned to do a art song cycle called Stargazing, based on the life of Elizabeth Breckenridge. She was a domestic worker who worked for the first president of Indiana University. And it's been the most wonderful thing to be able to create this piece. And now they bring it to life. The students are going to perform it. It's had a world premiere at Eastman. Several other opera singers are planning to sing it. But listening to that music as well, the things that we compose and all of those things, So I've got a playlist, but I would confess that most of it is on the sacred side, and then I'll turn to some of the other things every now and then, just as a release. And then many times I don't listen to anything because I do music so much, and I'm doing it every day, all day. When I'm done, I don't want to hear notes. Turn the radio off, turn the record player. Don't play a single note. I don't want to hear anything. I'm good. And just listening to nothing, if you will, is also a wonderful opportunity too.
That makes so much sense. But I want to make sure before anything closes, because I asked you all my questions. I did the music that speaks to me segment. I just want to make sure I thank you. But you did mention Margaret Vaughn. I love her. I just sang a piece by her called "The Minstrel Man." That's the
Yes,
Hughes poem.
yes, yes,
I
yes,
love her pieces so much. She's
yes,
amazing. And I'm
yes.
hoping, like, with one of my episodes, I want to do like an 18th, 19th century episode, and like
Mhm.
African Americans in that era. So I'm also doing a research project on Elizabeth
Greenfield.
Greenfield. Yeah.
Yes, yes. She
So
was
I'm
the
hoping.
first Black concert opera singer. And they called her the Black Swan. And
Yes.
the first to perform at the Buffalo Music Society. And she performed at the White House. And she traveled overseas and performed for the Queen. And all of this was during slavery times.
I
She had a
know.
tremendous gift. And
Yeah.
her owners recognized that gift, and they allowed for her to go overseas and study. And she became a wonderful concert artist, one of the first divas, if you will, prima donnas that we had of Black concert singers.
And so really excited. That's why when you mentioned Margaret Wise, I was like, yes, love her. All right, but thank you so much, Dr. Raymond Wise. I appreciate this so much.
You're
Uh,
welcome.
and I learned so much. It's gonna be so cool. Thank you. Hey everyone. Okay, so I just wanted to make sure that I thanked Dr. Wise again for coming on this show. I appreciate him so much. I appreciate when I reach out to people and they're really receptive to what I'm doing, and they're like super excited to share their knowledge with me, and I'm super excited to receive the knowledge. I feel like Dr. Wise, every time he talks, is like super informative, and he gives you a lot of information when he's speaking to you, which I appreciate so much because I feel like I'm learning something. Dr. Wise came to Crane in December 2022 to conduct 4 of our gospel pieces, and he was just amazing. And he taught us like some gospel like vocal techniques, and he went into like the differences between spiritual and gospel music, and started to talk to us about the history of gospel. And I felt like when I started to do this podcast that I definitely wanted to talk to Dr. Raymond Wise, and I had reached out to my friend Rose. Rose, I love you. Reached out to my friend Rose, and I asked her if I can have his email. She said yes, and I emailed him, and he was really like excited to work with me. So I'm so happy that Dr. Wise came onto the show. Thank you so much. But I did, because that interview was conducted over Zoom, and I do not have Zoom. What's the Zoom Plus, Zoom Premium? I think those are the words. The Zoom that costs money. I don't have like an over 45-minute time limit. So we started to run out of time, and I did want to make sure I thanked him, talked to him more about like what's going to happen afterwards, and just gave him some more information. So I didn't have a time to talk about the music that speaks to me, and I always enjoy talking about the music that speaks to me because I think it's such a fun segment of the show, and I'm happy that I got to mention it with Dr. Raymond Wise. I keep saying his full name, Dr. Wise, because I want to hear the people I'm interviewing's inputs. I want to hear what they're listening to. I want to hear what they're doing. So when he brought up that gospel music is his music, it was great because that's his specialty. And it's nice to see someone who's so passionate about what they're doing. I love talking to people about their passions and what they're doing, and them love doing it. So, but to go into the music that speaks to me. Right now, I've been a little all over the place. Not gonna lie to you. Not gonna lie. But I did want to bring this up. So I I was doing research during the winter. You guys know that I started my research prior to starting the podcast because I needed to find things that I wanted to talk about. I needed to find things I wanted to touch this semester. And I will touch on more to like what I'm thinking of touching on in the summertime and what kind of research I'm thinking of conducting in summertime, how I'm going to do my podcast in the summertime, who I'm interviewing in summertime. We'll go into all of that on my last episode, which is a transition episode. But when I was doing my research, I was watching the Queen movie, Bohemian Rhapsody, and I did not realize that Freddie Mercury was a person of color. He is Indian. And we don't talk about that at all. How this iconic person who made all of this iconic music is also a person of color, as well as a part of the LGBTQ plus community. You know, like this person is literally an icon. So I know a song by him that speaks to me is "Love of My Life." It's such a beautiful Queen song. Everyone should go listen to it. I love that song. Shit. Okay. No, but I love that song. But now let me get into my releasing issue. So I really do try. I really do try. The first time I tried, I set up the layout for my podcast because as I did a whole outline on my podcast, I knew exactly what I was going to talk about. It was supposed to do every Sunday. Not every Sunday, but every other Sunday, right? Then I did my first episode, perf. Then I ran into some issues with trying to get people on the podcast. And then I had to come up with, had to do an episode on something I've already did extensive research on, which was the rock genre. Then I was having a hard time getting approved by IRB, not because IRB was giving me a hard time. It's just it's not a long process, but the process can be long if things go wrong. So there were things that I had to kind of, maneuver, but it's okay. Shout out to Dr. Bug. He helped me a lot. Super, super big supporter when it came to me getting my IRB stuff approved. So then there was that. Then, I have to make sure I get consent from my interviewer. So anyone who's I'm interviewing, I make sure I get consent from them. And so I have to make sure I get a form back, all that stuff. That took a while. And then it also took a while for me to start editing because I was in my opera at school. And I also have a lot of other stuff going on with my internship. I do an internship and I'm vice president of a club. So I was very, very disappointed that it took me such a long time to get Dr. Dudley's episode out. But this time I was so determined to give you guys another episode the next week and try to stay on a pattern until the semester once the semester ends. And I'm hoping that, I get as much out as I possibly can because I feel like, this information is so valuable and I'm really, really enjoying the research and the things I'm learning. I learned so much from Dr. Wise. I learned so much from my conversation with Dr. Dudley. I learned so much when I was doing my research on rock. I learned so much from TJ and Zion and Vatressa and Jalen when we were talking about how we're contributions to music and how, Crane and us being in Crane and learning those perspectives of people of color within a music major. It helped me not feel so alone in a space that you feel alone in. So yeah, those are the things that are going on. My research is going really well. I'm, like I said, I think I said this, but I can't remember. I'm hoping to do an 18th, 19th, 20th century, that area episode on people of color in that area and how they've contributed to the Western classical realm. Because I'm talking about how we contribute to things, right? But I really want to talk about the things we've created that were taken, or the things that we've done that were iconic that there'd be, no one talks about. Like Elizabeth Greenfield, we talked about it with Dr. Raymond Wise, and like no one talks about that. So I really want to bring those things up. So I hope you guys enjoyed. Have a great night or day or whenever you're listening to this. And I cannot wait for you guys to hear the next one.